Your body starts breaking down the moment you leave Earth. Not slowly, not gradually. Within hours of entering microgravity, systems that took millions of years of evolution to build begin failing in ways that no engineer has fully solved. We knew this was happening to astronauts on the International Space Station. What we did not know was what happens when you go farther, past the magnetic shield that wraps around Earth like an invisible armor, out into the open radiation environment of deep space. Artemis II answered that question, and the answer was more unsettling than most people realize. 4 astronauts spent 10 days beyond Earth's protective field. No spacewalk, no explosion, no Hollywood emergency. Just 10 days of deep space doing what deep space does to a human body that was never designed to survive there. What the medical teams observed during and after that mission is going to change how we think about every crewed mission beyond low Earth orbit for the next 50 years. This is not a story about bravery or engineering. It is a story about biology and about how poorly equipped the human body is for the environment we are asking it to endure. Let's start with something that happens within the first few hours of reaching space. Something invisible, painless, and deeply dangerous. The moment gravity disappears, your circulatory system panics. On Earth, your cardiovascular system spends every second of every day fighting gravity. The heart pumps blood downward to the legs and feet, and the veins push it back up against the pull of the planet. It is a constant, active battle, and your body is extraordinarily good at it after a lifetime of practice. Remove gravity, and the system that was calibrated for that battle suddenly has nothing to fight against. Blood and other bodily fluids that normally pool in the lower half of the body, in the legs, the abdomen, the lower organs begin redistributing upward, toward the chest, toward the neck, toward the head. Astronauts have described the sensation as similar to hanging upside down, a persistent fullness in the face, pressure behind the eyes, a stuffed feeling in the sinuses that never quite goes away. This is not uncomfortable in the way a headache is uncomfortable. It is a structural shift in where the body's fluid volume is located, and it begins causing problems almost immediately. The human skull is a rigid container. Inside it sits the brain, surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid, a clear liquid that cushions the organ, removes waste products, and helps regulate the chemical environment around the neurons. Under normal Earth conditions, cerebrospinal fluid pressure is stable. The body has mechanisms to maintain it within a narrow range. In microgravity, as fluid shifts upward toward the head, pressure inside the skull begins to rise. This condition is called Spaceflight-associated neuro-ocular syndrome, and it was first formally identified after detailed analysis of astronaut medical records following long-duration missions on the International Space Station. The findings were alarming. Elevated intracranial pressure over weeks and months can cause measurable structural changes inside the skull. The optic nerve sheath, the tissue sleeve surrounding the nerve that connects the eye to the brain, swells under increased pressure. The back of the eyeball, normally spherical, can flatten. The optic disc, the point where the nerve enters the eye, can become edematous, swollen, and distorted. In some astronauts returning from long missions, vision had measurably changed, not temporarily, permanently. Post-flight eye exams on International Space Station, crew members had revealed refractive changes, shifts in how the eye focuses light that persisted for months after return and in some cases did not fully reverse. For the Artemis II mission, this was not a theoretical concern. It was a documented risk that the crew had been medically screened for and that researchers were actively monitoring. The difference between what had been observed on the station and what Artemis II represented was location. On the International Space Station, astronauts are in low Earth orbit, roughly 400 kilometers above the surface, still inside the outer boundary of Earth's magnetic field. That field provides partial protection from radiation and was thought to potentially play a role in some of the biological differences observed in orbit versus on the surface. Artemis II went far beyond that boundary. The crew traveled to lunar distance, nearly 400,000 kilometers from Earth, placing them fully outside the magnetic protection that had surrounded every long-duration mission before theirs. Nobody had medical data on humans in that radiation environment for 10 consecutive days. The Artemis II medical monitoring program was designed in part to begin filling that gap. Intracranial pressure changes were tracked using non-invasive measurement techniques throughout the mission. Fluid shift markers were monitored. Eye structure was examined both before launch and immediately after splashdown. The data from those examinations is still being analyzed and has not been fully released. But the researchers involved have been clear about one thing. 10 days was enough time for measurable biological changes to begin appearing. The fluid redistribution that happens in hours was documented. The early indicators of intracranial pressure elevation were present. The question the medical teams are now working to answer is whether 10 days at lunar distance produces different or more severe changes than 10 days in low Earth orbit would. The answer to that question will determine how long astronauts can safely remain at the end of Moon, and whether a 6-month journey to Mars is biologically survivable without medical interventions that do not yet exist. Now, let's talk about what was happening to the crew's muscles and bones simultaneously. Skeletal muscle requires mechanical load to maintain its structure. Every step you take on Earth, every time you stand up or carry something or push against resistance, your muscles receive signals that tell the tissue to maintain itself. Remove that load entirely, and the signal disappears. Within the first 24 to 48 hours in microgravity, the biochemical cascade that maintains muscle-protein balance begins shifting. The rate at which muscle protein is broken down starts exceeding the rate at which it is rebuilt. In practical terms, this means astronauts begin losing muscle mass almost immediately after entering space, not dramatically, not visibly, but measurably at the cellular level. On short missions, this loss is minor and recoverable. On longer missions, it accumulates into something significant. Data from International Space Station crew members returning from 6-month missions had shown muscle mass reductions of between 10 and 20% in major muscle groups, particularly in the legs and core, the postural muscles that spend the most time working against gravity on Earth. Exercise protocols on the station, which include resistance training equipment specifically designed for microgravity use, partially counteract this loss but do not eliminate it. For the Artemis II mission, 10 days was not long enough to produce the dramatic muscle loss seen in 6-month missions, but the early biochemical markers of atrophy were detectable. What researchers were particularly interested in was whether the deep space radiation environment, absent from Lockheed's Earth orbit missions, had any effect on the rate or character of muscle protein breakdown. Radiation damages DNA. That damage triggers cellular stress responses that are energetically expensive to repair. A body spending resources on radiation damage repair has fewer resources available for tissue maintenance. The question was whether this would show up in muscle biochemistry within 10 days. The answer requires full analysis of biological samples collected before, during, and after the mission, samples that are currently being processed. The bone loss picture is similarly concerning, and the timeline is similarly compressed. Bone tissue is constantly being broken down and rebuilt through the activity of two cell types: osteoclasts, which dissolve old bone material, and osteoblasts, which lay down new bone. On Earth, mechanical loading from gravity and movement stimulates osteoblast activity, keeping the two processes in balance. In microgravity, with no gravitational load on the skeleton, osteoclast activity begins outpacing osteoblast activity. Bone mineral density starts declining. The rate measured in International Space Station crew members on long missions had been approximately 1 to 2% per month in weight-bearing bones, the hips, the lower spine, the legs. This is faster than the bone loss rate in elderly people on Earth with osteoporosis. It is faster than any non-medical condition that produces bone loss in a healthy adult. Exercise helps. Bisphosphonate drugs, which suppress osteoclast activity, have been tested with some success. Neither fully stops the process. For a 10-day mission, the bone loss is not medically significant on its own, but the markers of accelerated bone breakdown, measurable in blood and urine, were expected to appear early, and the medical team was collecting those samples to establish baselines for what deep space bone physiology looks like at the start of the process. This matters because the Moon is not the endpoint. The Moon is the rehearsal. A crewed mission to Mars and back requires a minimum of approximately 2.5 years. A significant portion of that time would be spent in transit, in microgravity, exposed to deep space radiation, with whatever exercise equipment fits inside a spacecraft that is already packed with everything two people need to survive for months. The bone loss projections for a Mars mission, if current mitigation strategies remain unchanged, suggest that astronauts could arrive at Mars with bone density reductions severe enough to make fracture risk a genuine operational concern. Arriving at another planet with brittle bones after months of muscle loss is not an abstract medical problem. It is a mission-critical failure mode. Now, let's discuss the cardiovascular system. because the heart does not simply sit still while everything else is changing. On Earth, the heart pumps against gravity to move blood upward from the lower body. This constant demand keeps the cardiovascular system well conditioned in healthy adults. In microgravity, with fluid redistributed upward and the lower body effectively unstressed, the cardiovascular system begins to decondition. The heart receives more blood than usual because of the upward fluid shift and responds by reducing its own volume. The stroke volume, the amount of blood pumped per heartbeat, changes. The regulatory mechanisms that manage blood pressure under varying conditions begin recalibrating for an environment without gravitational stress. This recalibration is efficient and rapid. The body adapts to microgravity conditions within days. The problem is that those adaptations are maladaptive when gravity returns. Astronauts returning from even short missions frequently experience orthostatic intolerance, the inability to maintain stable blood pressure when standing upright. On Earth, standing up requires the cardiovascular system to rapidly compensate for the downward pull of blood toward the legs. The system does this automatically, through a rapid hormonal and neurological response that has been calibrated by a lifetime of gravitational experience. After days or weeks in microgravity, that calibration has shifted. The returning astronaut stands up. Blood rushes to the lower body as gravity reasserts its pull, and the cardiovascular system, now tuned for a weightless environment, does not respond quickly. The result can range from mild dizziness to fainting. For the Artemis II crew, the cardiovascular monitoring program tracked heart rate variability, blood pressure response, and fluid distribution markers throughout the mission. The goal was not just to document what was happening to these 4 astronauts. It was to establish a detailed physiological profile of how the cardiovascular system behaves in deep space, beyond low Earth orbit, compared to what the station data had already provided. That comparison is scientifically essential, because the radiation environment outside Earth's magnetic field may interact with cardiovascular physiology in ways that have not been measurable before. High-energy radiation damages endothelial cells, the cells lining the interior of blood vessels. Chronic radiation exposure has been associated with accelerated cardiovascular aging in laboratory studies using particle accelerators to simulate the space environment. The Artemis II mission was the first opportunity to measure cardiovascular markers in actual human beings actually exposed to the deep space radiation environment, not simulated, not modeled, not inferred from lower energy exposures on the station. The data from those 10 days represents something genuinely new in the history of space medicine. Now let's talk about the vestibular system, the inner ear's balance and orientation system, because this is where the subjective experience of space starts becoming genuinely disorienting. The vestibular system evolved over hundreds of millions of years to do one thing: tell the brain which direction is down. It does this through fluid-filled canals and chambers in the inner ear that sense rotational acceleration and the direction of gravitational pull. In microgravity, the gravitational signal disappears. The vestibular organs stop receiving the gravitational input they have been calibrated to interpret, and the brain receives conflicting signals from different sensory systems that all normally agree about orientation. The eyes report visual information. The vestibular organs report the absence of gravitational information. The proprioceptors in the muscles and joints report that no muscular effort is required to maintain posture. These signals, which have always been consistent on Earth, suddenly disagree. The brain attempts to reconcile them and frequently fails. The result is space motion, sickness, nausea, disorientation, vomiting that affects roughly 70% of astronauts during the first 1 to 3 days in microgravity. For most crew members, the symptoms resolve as the brain adapts and begins reweighting sensory inputs to function without gravitational reference. But adaptation to microgravity creates a new problem. When the crew returns to Earth and gravitational input suddenly reappears, the vestibular system, now adapted to weightlessness, is again receiving an input it has recalibrated to ignore. The readaptation process begins again in reverse, and for days, 2 weeks after return, coordination, balance, and spatial orientation are measurably impaired. For the Artemis II crew, vestibular monitoring included tracking eye movement patterns, balance assessments, and coordination tests both before and after the mission. Splashdown itself introduces an additional complication. The spacecraft and its occupants are subjected to the physical forces of atmospheric re-entry, parachute deployment, and ocean impact, all of which impose rapid, high-intensity vestibular and cardiovascular stress on a crew that has just spent 10 days in a weightless environment. The crews are physically caught in the spacecraft during landing and cannot stand independently for some time after recovery. Understanding exactly how the vestibular and cardiovascular systems perform under those conditions for crew members who have been in deep space rather than low Earth orbit is directly relevant to mission design for lunar surface operations. An astronaut who lands on the moon and needs to immediately perform physical tasks while still in a suit cannot afford the kind of vestibular and cardiovascular deconditioning that makes standing up difficult. Now we reach what may be the most consequential physiological story from the Artemis II mission radiation. Not because the crew received a dangerous dose during their 10 days. They did not. The Orion spacecraft's shielding, combined with the relatively calm space weather during the mission window, kept exposures within planned parameters. The reason radiation is the most consequential story is because of what it represents for everything that comes after. Earth's magnetic field, the magnetosphere, acts as a continuous planet-scale radiation shield. It deflects the majority of solar wind particles and a significant fraction of galactic cosmic rays before they can reach the surface or the astronauts in low Earth orbit. Outside the magnetosphere, none of that protection exists. Galactic cosmic rays are the most difficult part of the problem. These are high-energy particles accelerated by distant supernova explosions and other extreme astrophysical events, traveling at close to the speed of light in every direction simultaneously. They carry enough energy to pass through most shielding materials, aluminum, water, polyethylene with minimal reduction in dose. The shielding that stops lower-energy solar particles is largely ineffective against galactic cosmic rays. For a 10-day mission, the total accumulated dose from galactic cosmic rays is manageable. It falls within career exposure limits for astronauts and does not pose an acute health risk. The concern is cumulative and probabilistic. Each galactic cosmic ray particle that passes through biological tissue damages DNA in the cells it traverses. Most of this damage is repaired by the cell's own repair mechanisms. Some is not. A small fraction results in mutations that persist. Over a career of multiple deep space missions, or over a single long mission to Mars, the accumulated DNA damage from galactic cosmic ray exposure begins contributing meaningfully to long-term cancer risk. NASA's career exposure limits for astronauts are set based on a framework that limits additional lifetime cancer risk to a defined percentage. The problem is that galactic cosmic ray exposures during a Mars mission, by current projections, would push crew members past those limits, in some cases significantly past them, even with the best available shielding. The radiation biology community has been working on this problem for decades without finding a complete solution. The approaches under investigation include pharmaceutical countermeasures, drugs that suppress the best inflammatory responses triggered by radiation damage, reducing secondary tissue injury even when primary DNA damage cannot be prevented, dietary interventions involving antioxidant compounds that neutralize radiation-generated free radicals before they can damage DNA, genetic screening to identify individuals whose DNA repair mechanisms are unusually efficient, people who might be naturally better equipped to tolerate deep space radiation than the average population, and speculative engineering approaches, storm shelters lined with water or polyethylene, materials that are somewhat more effective at stopping lower energy particles that could provide temporary high shielding areas during peak solar particle events. None of these approaches fully solves the problem. The physics of galactic cosmic rays makes a complete solution unlikely, without either a dramatic breakthrough in shielding materials or a dramatic reduction in mission duration. The Artemis II mission contributed something specific and essential to this body of work, the Avatar payload. Before launch, bone marrow cells were extracted from the crew members' own blood samples using a new non-invasive collection technique. These cells, which are among the most radiation sensitive in the human body, were cultured and stored aboard the spacecraft throughout the mission. After splashdown, the cells were recovered and analyzed to measure the specific types and frequencies of DNA damage they had accumulated during 10 days of exposure to the deep space radiation environment. This was the first time radiation damage had been measured in human bone marrow cells, actually exposed to the environment beyond Earth's magnetic field, not modeled, not simulated with particle accelerators, actually exposed. The data from those cell cultures will provide the most direct measurement available of what deep space radiation does to the most radiation-sensitive tissue in the human body. The results will be compared against the crew members' own biological baselines established before the mission and against the radiation dosimetry data collected by instruments aboard the spacecraft throughout the 10-day period. Now let's talk about the immune system, because what happens to immune function in deep space is one of the stranger and less discussed aspects of space physiology. The immune system is not a passive structure. It is an active, energy-intensive biological defense network that requires continuous regulation and calibration. Physical and psychological stress affects immune function. This is well established on Earth. People under chronic stress show measurable suppression of certain immune responses and elevated inflammatory markers. Space is stressful. The confinement, the workload, the disruption of normal circadian rhythms by light-dark cycles that don't match Earth's 24-hour day, the background awareness of physical danger, all of these contribute to an immune stress environment that differs from anything experienced on Earth. One of the most consistently observed findings in astronaut health data from the space station era is the reactivation of latent viruses. Herpes viruses, the family that includes the virus causing cold sores, the virus causing chickenpox and shingles, and several others, are carried by most adults in a dormant state. The immune system continuously suppresses them, preventing them from actively replicating. In space, this suppression weakens. Astronauts on long missions show measurable increases in viral DNA from these latent viruses in their saliva and urine, indicating that the viruses are beginning to replicate at levels that would not occur in healthy, immune-competent individuals on Earth. Most of the time, this reactivation does not produce symptoms, but the presence of reactivating viruses is a reliable indicator that immune function has been compromised in some measurable way. For the Artemis II mission, immune monitoring included sampling protocols designed to detect these reactivation markers throughout the 10-day mission. The question was whether the deep space radiation environment, which can directly damage immune cells by passing through them, would produce more severe or more rapid immune suppression than what had been observed in the radiation-protected low Earth orbit environment. The concern is not just about cold sores. A compromised immune system is less effective at eliminating cancer cells, fighting bacterial infections, and controlling inflammatory responses that damage healthy tissue. For a crew member on a long Mars mission, immune dysfunction that might produce a minor and manageable problem during a 10-day mission could escalate into a serious medical situation when there is no way to return to Earth and no possibility of receiving hospital-level care. Beyond the biological measurements, the Artemis II mission also provided data on something harder to quantify but equally important: the psychological and cognitive effects of deep space confinement. The crew was isolated inside the Orion capsule, a spacecraft roughly the size of a large SUV, for 10 days. This is a different scale of confinement than the International Space Station, which has multiple modules, a cupola with Earth views, private quarters, and considerably more living volume. Orion is compact, functional, and austere. The crew slept in sleeping bags attached to the walls. Meals were prepared from packaged food. Exercise was performed in a confined space using resistance bands and body weight. The psychological monitoring program tracked cognitive performance through standardized testing, mood and stress indicators through questionnaires instruments, and sleep quality through wrist-worn actigraphy devices. Sleep in space is consistently poorer than sleep on Earth. The absence of natural light-dark cycles, the noise of the spacecraft's life support systems, the unusual temperature regulation of the sleeping environment, and the simple difficulty of sleeping while floating all contribute to disrupted sleep architecture that accumulates into sleep debt over the course of a mission. Sleep deprivation compounds every other physiological problem. Cognitive performance declines. Emotional regulation becomes less effective. Decision-making under pressure becomes more error-prone. For a crew of 4 sharing a small capsule for 10 days, managing sleep, interpersonal dynamics, task workload, and psychological well-being simultaneously represents a significant human performance challenge. The data from the psychological monitoring program will be compared against similar data from station crews to identify whether 10 days in the deep space environment, with the radiation exposure, the more confined quarters, and the complete absence of Earth visual reference produces different psychological signatures than long-duration missions in low Earth orbit. These comparisons matter for designing the habitat architecture, crew selection criteria, and mission scheduling for the longer missions that will follow. Now let's bring all of this together and talk about what the Artemis II medical data actually means for the future of human spaceflight. The challenges are real, documented, and not fully solved. Fluid redistribution and intracranial pressure elevation begin within hours and continue throughout the mission. Current countermeasures include lower body negative pressure devices, essentially vacuum suits for the legs, that draw fluid back downward. They do not fully replicate the effect of gravity. Muscle atrophy and bone loss begin within days. Exercise countermeasures partially offset them but require time, equipment, and physical resources that a crew under heavy workload may not always have available. Cardiovascular deconditioning happens over the same timeline as muscle and bone changes and increases the risk of post-landing incapacitation at exactly the moment when crew members may need to be physically capable of responding to emergency situations. Vestibular disruption affects the majority of crew members during adaptation and redaptation and impairs coordination and balance at both the beginning and end of the mission. Radiation accumulates throughout the mission, contributes to long-term cancer risk, damages DNA in radiation-sensitive tissues, and may interact with every other physiological system in ways that are still being characterized. Immune suppression increases the risk of latent virus reactivation, infection susceptibility, and inflammatory injury, particularly in combination with radiation exposure. Sleep disruption degrades cognitive performance and psychological resilience across the entire mission duration. No single one of these challenges, in isolation, would be mission terminating during a 10-day mission. The Artemis II crew completed their mission successfully, recovered from splashdown, and by all publicly available accounts are in good health. But extrapolate those 10 days into the timeline of a Mars mission, 2.5 to 3 years, with months in transit and months on the surface, and every one of these challenges transforms from a manageable inconvenience into a potential mission-ending threat. The bone loss alone, projected across a 2-year deep space mission without effective countermeasures, could leave crew members with fracture risks that compromise their ability to work on the Martian surface. The radiation accumulated across a round trip to Mars would, under current exposure models, push crew members past NASA's career limits for increased cancer risk. The psychological effects of 3 years of confinement, isolation, communication delays of up to 24 minutes each way, and complete inability to return home in an emergency are not fully characterized by any existing dataset. Artemis II did not solve any of these problems. It was not designed to. What it did was provide the first direct human, biological data from the deep space environment, beyond the magnetic shield, in the actual radiation field, inside the actual confinement of the actual spacecraft that will carry future crews to the moon. That data will be analyzed, published, debated, and incorporated into the design of the countermeasures, habitat architectures, exercise protocols, pharmaceutical interventions, and crew selection criteria that determine whether the missions that follow are survivable. The engineers who designed the space launch system solved the problem of getting 4 people to the moon and back. The biologists, physicians, and space medicine researchers who designed the Artemis II medical program are working on a harder problem. Getting 4 people to the moon and back is an engineering challenge. Getting them back healthy enough to go again, or to go farther, is a biological one. And the human body, shaped by millions of years of evolution on the surface of one particular planet, is not making that problem easy. 10 days in deep space was enough to demonstrate that every system in the body responds to the environment beyond Earth. Not catastrophically, not immediately, but measurably, documentably, and in ways that accumulate. The spacecraft gets us there. The question that Artemis II pushed to the front of every conversation in space medicine is whether the body inside the spacecraft can survive long enough to make the journey worth taking. We are closer to answering that question than we have ever been. We are also further from a complete answer than the public discussion of these missions usually suggests. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.